Welcome to Byrider Digital University. This lesson is part of a series designed to train the new CNAC finance manager or underwriter. The beginning lessons in this series were dedicated to training skills necessary to underwrite J.D. Byrider retail installment contracts. This lesson will begin a discussion on actions that must be taken once financing is approved, to include closing. This is the first part of a two-part lesson that will explain how to print closing documents from Discover, identify what documents are required during the closing, the importance of each document, and what should be emphasized in each document. The first part of the lesson will concentrate on documents that deal with the vehicle being purchased from J.D. Byrider, while the second part of the lesson will concentrate on closing documents required by CNAC. There is an old saying in the automobile finance business that a deal well closed is half collected. Statistically, I can't verify that this statement is either right or wrong because there are too many variables, but I can verify that a deal poorly closed can be harder to collect. Also, a poorly closed deal might land your franchise in civil court fending off a lawsuit for inappropriate selling or financing practices. Why take the chance? Closing with the customer is a reasonably straightforward process that any good finance manager or underwriter should be able to accomplish without a flaw. However, before I get to specific procedures, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes explaining why we conduct closings as we do at CNAC. If you think about it, the contract that the customer signs is really a J.D. Byrider contract. The customer is purchasing a vehicle. After the deal is completed, the contract is assigned to CNAC, but there is no doubt that the contract initially belongs to J.D. Byrider during the actual closing. So what, you say? Well, think about it again. If you were at the Ford store down the street, would they send the customer to a bank to close the deal? Obviously not. The F&I manager, who is an employee of the Ford store, closes the deal. Why then does J.D. Byrider's finance company, CNAC, close at our stores? The answer is the special relationship that exists between J.D. Byrider and CNAC. On your screen is a sample financing services agreement, a document that every J.D. Byrider store and CNAC should have on file. In a nutshell, the document says that because CNAC is the intended purchaser of the retail installment contract, and because the performance of the contract is beneficial to J.D. Byrider because, for example, it limits the potential for back-off, J.D. Byrider has CNAC communicate the closing with the customer. In effect, the financing services agreement provides a legal basis for J.D. Byrider to delegate closing authority to CNAC. In the J.D. Byrider system, preparation of the closing documents can be completed after the customer signs the preliminary purchase worksheet. You'll need the deal structure off the worksheet before the contract can be finalized. Once you have this information, you'll want to have all of the documentation prepared before the customer comes to closing. We don't want to delay the customer from leaving with their new purchase any longer than necessary. Preparation of the documents usually occurs while the customer is watching their pre-closing video. Historically, closing forms came from a number of different sources. Some of your forms were purchased from vendors, including most multi-part or manifold forms. Others came from the state. Warranty and service agreements came from Byrider Systems, and a few documents, like the Notice to Cosigner, were produced by Discover. Now, virtually all closing documents are produced in Discover, to include state-specific documents. The only exceptions are state documents that, due to their newness, haven't been programmed in Discover. Since I mentioned Discover, let me show you how to get to your forms. Once you're ready to prepare closing documents, log on to Discover, select your sales location, and click on the Sales Vehicle module in the Application column. Select the Contract Writer tab, and then the Summary tab. On the Summary screen, select the customer to be closed by clicking on the Edit button. The Customer's Contract Calculator screen will appear. Click on the Forms button at the bottom of the screen, and a list of closing forms will appear. Forms are displayed in three ways. If the form has a box in front of the title, the form is applicable to the deal and can be printed as part of a group. If the form title does not have a box in front of the title, the form is not applicable to the deal. If a circle appears in front of the form title, the form is applicable to the deal but has a PDF format and can't be printed with the forms preceded by a box that are in an RTF format. To print all boxed forms, click on Select All, and a check mark will appear in the box in front of all boxed forms. You can also choose to select each boxed form for individual printing. To print a circled form, click on the circle. You can click on another form to unselect a circled form, or you can choose Unselect All. When you are finished selecting the forms, click on Print Selected Forms at the bottom of the screen. Choose Open on the pop-up box that appears, and then the selected boxed forms will appear in Microsoft Word Viewer. Selected circled forms will appear in PDF format in Adobe Acrobat. In either case, you will select Print from the menu at the top of the screen to print the forms. Once the documents are printed, a date and time will populate the screen in the last printed column. If you click on Refresh, times and dates will update to reflect the last time that a document was printed. Okay, now that you know what to do, what documents are required during closing, and what should be emphasized on each document? The answer to these questions will vary from state to state, but there is a reasonably standard set of forms that must be completed in order to make the deal legal and binding. I'll go through these documents one at a time. If the customer brings their own interpreter to help explain the sales and finance documents, you must have the customer sign the buyer-provided translator acknowledgement form. This form is an acknowledgement by the customer that the purchase and financing transaction with JD Byrider were negotiated in English, and that the documents used in the transaction are produced in English. The customer signing this document also acknowledges that the translator is not an employee or agent of JD Byrider. Once the document is signed, or if the customer is English speaking and doesn't require a translator, congratulate the customer on their purchase. Tell them that JD Byrider and CNAC are two different companies. In the future, they will deal with JD Byrider when servicing the vehicle and with CNAC for the terms of the contract. Let them know that they will receive copies of all the documents that they signed today. They should also be advised to ask questions and to read documents if they are unsure of what is being said. Once the translator acknowledgement has been completed and signed, or if the buyer has not provided a translator, the next thing that you must do is have the customer sign the consent to audio tape and videotape vehicle sale, financing, and closing form. As a company best practice, all closings should be recorded, and a copy of the proceedings should be retained for 5 years and be stored in a consistent and organized manner. When discussing the form with the customer, you should advise them that the closing is being both audio and video recorded to protect both parties in the transaction should a question arise down the road. This is a simple document. You need only ask their approval and then have them sign and date the document.
So I can
Before they
review it
sign
at
the
home.
document, if you haven't done so already,
I
have
stay
them
late at
verify
night,
the
man.
spelling of their name and address, and then ask them to sign all documents as their name appears on the contract. Our next document is the buyer's order. The information on this form should parallel the preliminary purchase worksheet and is used during closing to substantiate the deal. At the top of the form is information on the vehicle being purchased. Care should be taken that the mileage reflected is the same as that on the odometer statement. Mileage and the VIN should be provided to you by the salesperson after visual confirmation. The next portion of the form verifies the specifics of the deal and should be covered line by line. Clearly, if an objection surfaces, you want to get it resolved prior to seeking a signature on the contract. The next section of the form covers the trade-in vehicle if there is one. Again, the mileage and VIN should be provided to you by the salesperson. The next section covers the DIP schedule and provides you with a great opportunity to ensure that the customer understands the importance of DIP payments and that they must be paid in a timely manner. The customer should also be advised that down payments and trade are non-refundable. When you complete discussion of the first page, review the terms and conditions on the second page that's not shown here, and then ask the customer if they have any questions. This is a request that you should make when completing every form. If there are no questions, have the customer and co-buyer, if there is one, sign on the front page and initial on the back. Each state will have its own requirements and documentation that cover issues such as the transfer of titles. Titling and licensing documents are available in Discover for all states in which franchisees operate. However, finance managers should keep abreast of the specific requirements of their state to ensure that they're in compliance. Many states will require that you prepare powers of attorney that allow CNAC to act in the customer's behalf when making transactions involving the certificate of title or registration of the vehicle. If the customer has a trade-in, 2 powers of attorneys will be required. Additionally, you will want to check with your state BMV because some states require that power of attorneys be notarized, which needs to be done at the time of signature. Federal law requires that the mileage on a vehicle be disclosed at the time of purchase. Again, ensure that the VIN and current mileage are accurate and have been visually confirmed. Your customer signs as the transferee on the federal odometer disclosure statement. If the customer has a trade-in, a separate odometer statement is required. In this case, the customer would sign as the transferor and the byrider representative would sign as the transferee. In states where title work is conducted in CNAC, it's common for the customer to come back to the store to pick up the documents. Their instructions to do so are included in the customer title pickup notice. The document tells the customer the approximate date that the pickup will be ready and that they will not be otherwise informed. Having the customer come back to the store provides store personnel to speak with the customer should there be a reason for discussion, such as missing steps or delinquency. Next, the salesperson should have provided you with a 2-sided buyer's guide that was removed from the vehicle being purchased. Your discussion of the buyer's guide provides you with a good opportunity to transition to the warranty or service agreement. Tell the customer that federal law requires that you provide them with the buyer's guide for the vehicle they are purchasing and that the vehicle comes with a limited warranty. Ensure that dealer information is included on the back of the form. How you present the service contract or limited warranty to the customer at closing will help you avoid future misunderstandings with the customer should their vehicle have mechanical issues. There is little difference between closing the service agreement and warranty. Virtually all of the elements are the same with 2 significant differences that I'll show you in a minute. Point to the terms of coverage and ensure that the customer understands that the coverage is good for a specific number of months or number of miles, whichever comes first. Cover the deductible, telling the customer that they will be charged the fee, if any, if they make a claim. If selling a service agreement, remind them of the cost of the agreement. If issuing a warranty, the cost is included in the sales price of the vehicle. If the customer is purchasing a service agreement, advise the buyer that they are not required to purchase the service agreement as a condition to purchasing the vehicle. Advise the customer that for them to make a claim, they must call the contract administrator whose number is on the agreement. Make sure they understand not to call CNAC for service. Furthermore, make sure the customer understands that no work should be performed without proper authorization. Tell the buyer that it's necessary for them to conduct routine maintenance on their vehicle or their warranty or service agreement may be voided, and state your policy on towing, rentals, and loaner vehicles. Finally, go over what is and isn't covered by the warranty or agreement. Occasionally, after the sale of a vehicle, a customer may claim he or she was not aware that additional items such as insurance products were purchased at an additional cost, or they may claim they were required to purchase such additional items. It is illegal and against byrider policy to require the purchase of additional items. The buyer's statement regarding the purchase of additional items is your insurance against such accusations. This document, signed by the customer, clearly states that the purchase of additional items is voluntary and not a condition for purchasing the vehicle. On the screen is a service order, sometimes referred to as a due bill or we owe. Even if the customer has not been promised work on their vehicle, a service order should be marked as such and signed and placed in the deal jacket to confirm that no work was promised. Be very specific when identifying work to be done. Leave nothing to the interpretation of the customer or the service department. Furthermore, if your store participates in the Best Extended program, have the customer arrange the service call associated with the service order through the Best Extended number to get used to the process. You will want to make sure that your customer is aware of the service department's operating hours and policies. Let them know that service is done by appointment only. Restate your towing, rental, and loaner policy and advise them that work not covered by the warranty or service agreement must be paid in full when the vehicle is picked up. Well, that completes the documents associated with the vehicle and JD Byrider. Well, that's it for now. Don't forget to take the second part of this lesson that will continue the discussion of the closing documents required by CNAC. There is always more to learn, so I'll be speaking to you again from Byrider Digital University. Have a great day. Welcome to Byrider Digital University. This lesson is part of a series designed to train a new CNAC finance manager or underwriter. This is the second part of a two-part lesson that continues a discussion of the closing process. In part one of this lesson, you learned how to print closing documents in Discover, along with the identification and importance of documents related to the vehicle being purchased. In part two, we are going to discuss finance-related closing documents and what should be emphasized in each document. We will also address the question whether there is a set order in which closing documents should be presented. The first document we will discuss is the buyer's agreement to obtain and maintain insurance. If your customer has not purchased insurance, make them aware that they have a specified number of days to purchase coverage for fire, theft, and collision with a loss payable endorsement for CNAC. In addition, make sure that the customer understands that insurance is mandatory as a condition of financing and that they will be in default of their contract if insurance lapses. Also, tell the customer that when purchasing a policy, there is a maximum $500 deductible on collision. The buyer should also be advised that if they have an accident, they should notify CNAC immediately. If you have a cosigner, explain that they are being asked to guarantee the debt in the event that the buyer does not do so, for whatever reason. If they understand their obligation, obtain the cosigner's signature on the notice. Periodically, there is a need to identify a person with whom CNAC can discuss the customer's contract. This most often occurs when the nature of the customer's work makes him or her difficult to contact. The third-party contact authorization form gives CNAC personnel the ability to discuss the details of the contract with the designated person. Have the customer complete the spaces for the third party's information, and then they must sign and date the form. The next form the customer should sign is the irrevocable power of attorney. This form gives CNAC the authority to act on behalf of the customer in order to have the vehicle released from an impound lot, garage, repair shop, police custody, or otherwise. The form also provides that any money advanced by CNAC in order to recover the vehicle is added to the amount the customer owes. In addition, the form also allows CNAC to negotiate with the customer's insurance company in the event that the vehicle is damaged. This form must be notarized. That gets us to the central document of the closing, the retail installment contract and security agreement. This document is the customer's agreement to purchase and pay for the vehicle. However, before I cover the contract, I want to make one thing clear. Federal law requires that customers approved for financing must be provided with a risk-based pricing document prior to their being contractually obligated. It doesn't matter when the document is presented, just so that it's done prior to the customer signing the contract. That said, above all, when discussing the contract, be clear and factual in your presentation. Depending on your location, the contract can be 4 or more pages. The customer and co-applicant, if there is one, will initial each page of the document after you have reviewed it and answered all of their questions. Begin with the first page by telling the buyer that JD Buyrider is the seller and the customer is the buyer of the vehicle. Describe the vehicle that the customer is purchasing and the customer's trade-in if applicable. Your next stop is the truth in lending disclosures. Go through each block disclosing the specific information. Then move to the payment schedule and explain the DIP and regular payment numbers, amounts, and schedules. Lastly, on this page, advise the buyer that there is no penalty if the contract is paid off early. The next area to cover is the itemization of amount finance section. Go through it line by line. You will once again explain that fire, theft, and collision coverage insurance is required and that the deductible cannot exceed $500. Next, and if applicable, explain to the buyer that they have purchased an optional service contract. Describe the coverage of the contract and the effective months and miles of coverage. Subsequent paragraphs of the contract cover many important items, including our remedies if the customer defaults, and charges should the customer provide us with a check for which there are insufficient funds, etc. Next is the arbitration section. Tell the customer that JD Buyrider includes an arbitration clause in all its contracts. Should the customer be involved in a dispute with JD Buyrider or CNAC arising from the purchase, sale, financing, or servicing of the vehicle, and if the claim is in excess of $12,000, the claim will automatically go to binding arbitration and cannot be pursued in court. This is an advantage to all parties to the contract by saving time in court or attorney costs. You also want to explain the opt-out clause to the customer, informing them that they may opt out of arbitration if they inform you in writing and postmark no later than 10 days after the contract is signed. Once you are done explaining arbitration, tell the customer that once the contract is signed, CNAC at any time can sell the contract to a third party, and if this happens, the terms of the contract will not change. Also, point out that the contract contains the notice to buyer that states that the buyer understood the terms of the contract. Ask the buyer if they understood everything that you explained. If they respond affirmatively, ask if they have any questions. If the customer doesn't have any questions, offer them the opportunity to read the contract. If they decline, or once they are done reading, have the customer sign and date the last page of the form. Make sure that the assignment box on the first page is signed and dated, and all pages other than the last page are initialed. The buyer's statement of understanding serves to reinforce the buyer's obligations. Reading clearly and deliberately, the finance manager or underwriter should read one paragraph at a time, having the buyer and co-buyer, if there is one, acknowledge their understanding of the paragraph by initialing on the line next to the passage. This procedure should be followed until all paragraphs have been read. Then have the buyer or buyers sign and date the document. Have your customer review and sign the consent to monitor and record telephone calls. This form gives JD Buyrider and CNAC the authority to monitor and record phone calls with the customer. This signed form allows JD Buyrider and CNAC to use telephone records in connection with any dispute that may arise in connection with the business call, and also allows a collection supervisor to monitor a collector's telephone technique. On occasion, you will close a deal without having all of the customer's required documents immediately available. For example, pay stubs, references, or utility bills. To ensure that these documents are provided, have the customer sign and date the requested additional information form. Ensure that all the required documents are listed on the form, as well as the number of days or date allowed for delivery. Also, make sure to advise the customer that non-compliance is a violation of the contract. At this point in the closing, you can cover the customer's automatic payment options depending on availability at your location. Your location may offer automatic payments through the customer's checking or savings account, or you may give them an option of using a debit or a credit card. If they have already agreed to use this option, you will have them review and complete, sign, and date either the automatic payment ACH authorization, ACH standing for Automated Clearinghouse, or the automatic card payment authorization form. If they have not agreed or been offered the option, take this opportunity to explain the advantages of not having to worry about late payments. The next document that you'll cover with the customer is the Schedule of Deferred Down Payments and First Regular Installment Payment, which is also known as the DIP calendar. This document is used to clarify and express the importance of the customer making on time their DIP payments and the first regularly scheduled payment. On the calendar, point out the date of each DIP payment and the first regularly scheduled payment. Review the payment schedule and remind the customer that dates cannot be changed and there are no grace periods. At your location, you may also use the customer payment calendar that identifies the dates of regularly scheduled payments for up to a 40-month period. If you do use this document, explain it to the customer again, reinforcing that payments are due on time. There is one other important task that you need to accomplish once all of your documents have been signed by the customer. Some documents require a JD Byrider signature. You will need to obtain these signatures from an authorized JD Byrider employee if they were not previously obtained. Although the Financing Services Agreement delegates closing responsibility to CNAC, it doesn't relieve JD Byrider of the responsibility to authorize or approve the various actions completed during closing and prior to assignment of the contract. The presence of a JD Byrider signature provides the requisite authority or approval. All that's left to do now is to provide the customer with his or her copy of the closing documents, remind them one more time of their first payment, and thank them for their business. When you close with the customer, is there a specific order that must be followed? The answer is no. There are many paths that can be followed that will result in a solid close. However, I do have one rule to pass along and a recommendation. First, the rule. As I've previously discussed, all closings should be recorded. There should be no exceptions to this best practice. This being the case, it is mandatory that all closings begin with the customer signing the consent to record the proceedings along with the translator agreement, if applicable. Now the recommendation. While there is no set manner in which closing documents must be presented, it's logical that the documents associated with the sale of the vehicle and those associated with financing be clustered in two groups. I've titled these two groups Byrider and CNAC. Let's look at Byrider first. All of the documents you see listed under JD Byrider are related in one way or another to the sale of the Byrider vehicle. There may be more documents in this cluster depending on the state in which you're operating, or perhaps due to your store's policy. You want to get all of these documents out of the way early in the process because you want the customer leaving your office thinking about the Byrider program, not the car. That gets us to the second cluster, all the finance-related documents. Does it make any difference in what order the documents are presented within a cluster? The answer is yes and no. For example, you don't want to present the buyer's statement of understanding to the customer until you have the retail installment contract signed. On the other hand, it wouldn't hurt the process if you had the customer sign their agreement to obtain and maintain insurance before the contract. The one hard and fast rule that you should follow is to be consistent. Like an actor who has honed his skills through hundreds of performances, the closer will become better and more polished in his or her presentation if the closing is conducted in the same fashion, time after time after time. Well, that pretty much wraps it up, but with all the discussion about the documents and their use, I don't want you to lose sight of what we are attempting to accomplish during the closing process. First and foremost, we want the customer's attention on the program and not on the car. If you do your job well, the customer's thoughts when they leave the closing should be when their first payment is due. Even with all the emphasis being placed on the truth in lending portion of the contract, you also want to ensure that all closing documents are thoroughly explained and that all required disclosures made. Everyone, including your boss, will know if you are meeting the mark because all closings are recorded. And last, you want to ensure that the customer fully understands their contractual obligations. That's it for preparing for closing. In the next lesson, we'll demonstrate what a good closing should look like. Until then, have a great day, and I'll be speaking to you again soon from Byrider Digital University.